So, um, validation can, in some cases, be used in place of verification in situations where the results cannot be measured or the cost of verifying is too high. So this pretty much is just saying that although you might classify something as verification, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't validate it. It can be validated, but of course, you want to have a good reason why, and ultimately, this can come down to the results cannot be measured or the cost of verifying is too high, so then you just validate. So again, validate when a process cannot be fully verified by inspection and test. So this kind of gives you a rule of thought of once you can use validation when verification does not work. So processes which may be covered by verification. So if you just want to do a verification step instead of a validation test, this can be done if you're testing for color, turbidity, total pH for solutions. If you want to do a visual inspection of printed circuit boards, testing of wiring harnesses, or manual cutting processes. So this can go through a verification step instead of a validation phase because these ultimately, if you look at these process steps, it's no direct product impact, no quality impact, nothing really directly impacting your process. So these ultimately can be covered by verification instead of a validation. And ultimately, verification it's not as heavily documented. There's not as many steps. When you validate, there's a series of steps you must go through, but verification usually is a little bit more simpler process. So when you have the opportunity to do a verification over validation, more than likely you'll want to jump on that because there's not a lot that goes into it compared to a validation. So here's a pharmaceutical example of verification. So 100% visual inspection of the final drug product and its final container for each batch produced. You have non-destructive activity. Inspector must see defects in the product or drug closure, and operators are trained by challenges to ensure that they are able to detect any defects for which the drug product is being evaluated. Um, so this is an example of a pharmaceutical real-world example of verification. Um, so here you're just verifying uh, that the product is good. You don't necessarily have to go through a validation step. This is kind of like the final step, but a verification can suffice in this aspect because uh, you're trained to ensure that you're able to detect it. The inspector must see defects in the product or drug closer, and it's a non-destructive activity. So in this case, you can do a verification instead of a validation. So you have software engineering standards known as IEEE SCD 610, which defines verification as a test of a system to prove that it meets all its specified requirements at a particular stage of its development. So this ultimately is the software engineering standard of the definition of verification. And one thing to note, IEEE stands for Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. So the phrase at a particular stage of its development is the key part of verification. The verification of development refers to checking application that is still being developed to ensure that it adheres to the specifications. Uh, these checks could be as simple as reading the specifications and comparing them against the code logic to make sure they line up. So again, example of when you can verify the phrase of what it means and as comparison to validate. So going into validation, validation typically involves actual testing and takes place after verifications are completed. The validation and verification process continues in a cycle until the software is free of defects. So again, when you go into if you have to validate and you went through verification, validation usually happens after the verification are completed. Again, validation ultimately uh, is what's giving you the confidence that your product or your process can be done over and over again without any interruption. So validation ultimately is the higher up over verification. So this gives a snapshot of verification versus validation. So we go through each of this and we can discuss. So as per IEEE SCD 610, the definition verification is a test of a system to prove that it meets all its specified requirements at a particular stage of its development, whereas validation is activity that ensures that an end product stakeholders' true needs and expectations are met. So this is their definition of verification versus validation. Then you go into the process of verification, ensuring we're developing the product according to specifications, and then validation, testing and validating the actual product to ensure we have developed it correctly. And verification it involves little or no code execution. Validation, code execution. The activities included in verification are reviews, walkthrough inspections. Validation is black box testing, white box testing, non-functional tests. So it's more testing. Activity type is low level versus validation is high level. The method process type, verification, a static method of checking documents and files. And then validation is a dynamic process of testing the real product. Target and verification is the application, software architecture, and validation is the actual product. And answers the question, verification, am I building the product right? And validation, am I building the product? So this is the comparison snapshot of verification versus validation. Some other examples we can look at. Development of a spreadsheet. So you want to verify that the calculations for the basic math functions are accurate before formulas are developed. Validation of the spreadsheet ensures finished products meets customers' needs. So if you're doing a verification, it's just verifying that the calculations for the basic math functions are accurate. Then when you want to validate, it's more of your finished product. Does it meet your customers' needs? So again, example of verification versus validation. So another example. Imagine yourself going to a restaurant and ordering blueberry pancakes. When you get your order, you will verify that they look like pancakes. The blueberries can be seen and they smell right. You will then have to eat it to be sure that the food is as you expected. So when you get your food, the verification process is, okay, does it look like pancakes? I see the blueberries. They smell right. That's more of a verification process. But the validation process, the ultimate goal is, does it taste as you expected? And when you do that and it meets your acceptance criteria, that's when you have validated this breakfast. So we go into a ventilator example. So the scenario is building a ventilator that keeps a patient breathing and that it works during patient transport. So the user need is the ventilator is suitable for use during in-hospital transport of patients. So if you want to do some validation tests on this, so what tests are you going to do to make sure the user's needs are met? You'll test that the ventilator can be rolled easily by 15 members of hospital transport staff. You want to ensure that the ventilator operates within its specifications while being rolled down hallways, over door jambs, and over elevator thresholds. So again, here it looks like you're testing worst case scenarios. You're going to put it through your worst case scenarios and make sure can it still operate even after going through these worst case scenarios. And then lastly, ventilator operates within its specification while transitioning between AC power and battery operation. So if you're going from AC power to battery, you want to make sure that, hey, is it still operating correctly during this, again, worst case condition? So This right here is more example of maybe an URS you would see, and where you're building your user URS or user requirement specification. Used to validate. Ultimately, you want to see the user need, and then you have to do a test to make sure that the user's need can be met, and you need to make sure it passes before you can say, "Hey, your system is validated and we can use it."